Hello, folks. J. Scott Phillips here, and today we are bound for a couple of things. One, once again, I'm going to return to the golden age of science fiction. I've been doing a little series. I'm only a couple of videos into it so far. This will be the third, and that's where I'm looking at significant stories and writers of science fiction, beginning with the dawn of the golden age, which is widely accepted as beginning with this issue here of Astounding Magazine, the July 1939 issue. And today, I'm going to move on to the August 39 issue of Astounding, which had the very first ever Robert Heinlein short story that he ever published or had published in any magazine or other publication. But the second thing is also, this is my entry for the first week of New World's November, which is this is I believe, the second year for New World's November, which was started by the Bookish Bryants and has a whole host of co-hosts, and I'll go through those here in a second. But what New World's November does is it celebrates science fiction, which I try to do quite a bit of here on my own channel anyway. But New World's November breaks it into some structured, kind of gives it more of a universal structure, format for all these hosts that are also doing their own content for science fiction. And this being week one, covers stories that are set in a terrestrial setting. So that would mean planet Earth. And so this works out well for my Golden Age review here, because the story that I'm going to be covering here, Robert Heinlein's Lifeline, his first story ever, as I say, takes place completely on Earth. That's just a short story. So, and it's set in 1939. And it's completely terrestrial, although a very interesting science fiction device that he uses in it. Let me get back to the New World's November here, because there's a number of hosts. As I say, it was started by the Bookish Bryants, and this year it's being co-hosted by, there's a long list here, Steve Donahue, Sean D. Standfast, Michael K. Vaughan, The Bookclectic, Another Bibliophile Reads, Jim Reads Too Slow, as I'm doing right now, Book Time with Elvis, Unlimited Reads, Science Fiction Reads, Rambling Reviewer, Read by Fred, and Books, Songs, and Other Magic. That's a lot of co-hosts. I'm not a co-host, but I'm just dipping my toe into the pool here because I've just got something to talk about today. Now, as I say, this week's week number one of New World's November, the theme is terrestrial. Now, week two is going to be extraterrestrial. So to me, that doesn't just mean off the Earth. To me, that means another planet. I suppose technically you could say it's anything off or away from the Earth, so it could be in outer space, I suppose. But to me, extraterrestrial is another planet. Terrestrial is Earth, and extraterrestrial is a planet outside of Earth. You could probably build a case for anything off the Earth, but that's my take on it. Then week three is to read a work of classic science fiction. So this here, classic science fiction, they are defining as anything that was written 1965 or earlier. So the Heinlein story I'm going to talk about here in a minute definitely falls into that category. But hopefully I'll have something else for week three that's also another classic science fiction. And then week four is robots or AI. So that rounds off the weekly themes, but there's also sub-themes that can be kind of tapped into at any point, and there's a number of these. So one is alien archaeology. 2 is alien romance. 3 is a translated work. 4 is alternate worlds or dimensions. 5, the far future. 6, war or military. 7 is genre crossing. 8 is first contact. 9, one of my favorites, time travel. 10 is invasion. 11, humorous. 12, political. And 13, libraries. So there's a few that are kind of unique there, and some of them are more typical that you would expect. And then, of course, these can all overlap each other too any combination. Then there's extra credit. This is quite the event here. Extra credit would be that if you can read anything in science fiction under any of these categories here, but then how does that translate into another medium? Could be a movie, a TV series, maybe a graphic novel, anything outside of the original book or publication that it was originally appeared as or in. So that's the background for this video, and without further ado, let's get into Lifeline by Robert Heinlein. Robert Heinlein was born in 1907, and he grew up in Kansas City, Missouri. He came from a military family, and their tradition was that there had been a Heinlein that had fought in every American war since the Revolution. So in 1925, he entered the Naval Academy in Annapolis, and he went into engineering there. And he was planning on making that his career, to follow in the family's footsteps there. But in August of 1934, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis, and he was discharged from the Navy. So he moved to Los Angeles to enter UCLA and study chemistry and physics there. But that didn't last too long, because he got interested in politics, in local politics, and decided to change careers at that point. He ran an unsuccessful campaign. It didn't go too well for him, and he realized that politics wasn't going to be his new career either. Now, at this time, by 1938, he was already on his second marriage, married to Lifeline Heinlein, and realized that he's got to find something else to do. He was still living on his naval pension, which was basically covering the bills enough, but it wasn't going to get ahead on that, and I don't believe that that was being adjusted for inflation in those days. It was 1938. So he decided to try his hand at writing, and he was inspired by H.G. Wells and Edward Bellamy's utopian works, and tried to write a book with kind of that in mind. And he wrote For Us the Living. Took him quite a while to write that, and he bounced a lot of ideas off of his wife, and they discussed it, kind of polished some points, but really it just turned out to be kind of more of a series of lectures and philosophies and things, and it didn't really quite hold together. He did send it around to some publishers, and it was just rejected everywhere he sent it. So at some point later, he decided the novel was so bad that he should just destroy all the manuscripts that he had. So he did that and considered them all just gone and would never see the light of day. However, there was a manuscript out there somewhere, one that he had sent to somebody and had lost touch with, that resurfaced towards the end of the century and got published in December of 2003. So you can get that book now, For Us the Living, Robert Heinlein's very first ever written novel, but he didn't want it published, and apparently a lot of critics agreed with him. You can get it and read it, but it apparently is not recommended. I have a copy of it, and I've sort of taken the advice. I have not decided to jump in and read it. It sounds like it could be kind of a slog. However, he felt that when he wrote it, he did kind of learn some lessons. And that served the rest of us well, because in the October 1938 issue of Thrilling Wonder Stories, an announcement appeared. It appeared in the regular monthly feature for the Science Fiction League, and it was a new contest that was calling for new writers to submit their short stories, and it would be paid to one winner a month at Thrilling Wonder Stories' regular rate of half a cent per word. Now, I've spent most of my career in advertising and marketing, so them calling this a contest, I think, was just sort of a marketing ploy. Really, any new writer who would have sent in a manuscript, regardless of a contest or not, would have been selected. Was it good enough? And even with the contest here, they would have had to have been good enough to publish, would have been also paid at that same rate of half a cent per word. So really it was just to kind of get a buzz going and probably to generate more submissions than they would normally be getting. Competition for science fiction magazines in those days, especially with Campbell having taken over Astounding Science Fiction recently, the competition was high, and so they just wanted to get some new material coming in, some fresh blood. So Heinlein saw this as an opportunity. Maybe he could get back in writing fiction again, but in a short story, maybe he wouldn't have the same problems that he felt he was having in writing a fuller novel. So he took 4 days and wrote his first short story ever, Lifeline. And when he got it done, he thought it was good enough. It was too good to send into Thrilling Wonder Stories. And he thought, Campbell is paying twice the rate that Thrilling Wonder Stories is paying, a penny a word. The only problem is that Heinlein didn't know if this was really science fiction or fantasy. But he decided to send it to John W. Campbell Jr. anyway, because he was the editor not only of Astounding Science Fiction, but also of Unknown, which was another Street and Smith pulp magazine, which featured on more fantasy stories and mysteries, things like that. So if he sent it to Campbell and Campbell bought it, he would put it in the proper magazine for the proper genre and still pay him a full cent a word. Well, Campbell got the manuscript and bought it, and he paid Heinlein $70 for that short story, which in today's money is about $1,400. So receiving a check like that in 1938 for just 4 days' work, Heinlein was bowled over, and his famous response to that was, "How long has this racket been going on?" So we'll never know if his story would have sold to Thrilling Wonder Stories or not. And then if it had, what his career might have been like that, having first entered into the writing field through Thrilling Wonder Stories and not with Campbell. Now, Campbell and Heinlein became a pretty solid team for a while there in the late 30s and into the 40s. So things might have gone a little differently otherwise. But we do know that the first winner of that contest for Thrilling Wonder Stories was none other than Alfred Bester in the April 1939 issue of Thrilling Wonder Stories for his short story, The Broken Axiom. But that's another story. We're talking about Heinlein and his first short story, Lifeline, which first appeared in the August 1939 issue of Astounding Science Fiction. Now, Heinlein's story was about his scientist, Dr. Pinero, who has invented a machine that can accurately predict the hour and minute of anyone's death that is read by the machine. Heinlein's inspiration, or at least he got the idea from this, unfortunately, was due to the death of a high school girlfriend years before. He was getting ready to propose to her, in fact, and then he got the news that she had died of an appendicitis. And that was somehow the inspiration for wanting to be able to predict, or the idea of a machine that maybe could somehow predict how long someone might actually live. Now, Pinero's concept for his machine is an interesting one. It's based on the supposition that we are fourth dimensional beings. We exist in space-time as kind of these long four-dimensional fleshy worms, he describes it as, that exist not only in space and of time. And the three-dimensional aspect of any given lifetime is just our regular image of a human being's body. But if you extend that through space-time, and you can send an electrical impulse up through that timeline, through that fleshy worm, the signal will echo off the far end of it at the moment of death and bounce back to the machine in the present. And then therefore you can get an accurate prediction of the moment that life stops. for that person being read on the machine. Now, you would think that the idea of being able to know exactly when you're going to die would have all kinds of implications in the story, and there are a few, but it really raises the question when you're reading this story that would you want to know when you are going to die if you had the choice of being able to know that, and what would you do with that? It's really kind of mind-boggling to think about what that might be like. And there's some of that in the story, but really it focuses more on the social aspect. I don't know if this is a social aspect, a commercial aspect of how does this affect life insurance companies? Because Pinero's machine now is kind of screwing with all their probabilities and statistics and actuaries that they depend on, because now people can know exactly when they're going to die. So there's some courtroom action revolving that. But it's a really fun and clever story. For Heinlein's first story, very good. He came out of the chute just swinging with both barrels there. I'm mixing some metaphors, but it's really good. Of course, he got even better after that. But what a great first run. Now, as I say, this was only Heinlein's first story, but he already had this idea of writing stories in what he considered to be a future history. So his stories would all be told in a timeline that could span centuries, really. They would all have a common timeline to tie them all together. And Lifeline was he considered that to be part of that timeline. Some people, I guess afterwards, has decided that it doesn't really tie in with any of the other stories, but originally it was intended to, and in fact it shows up in a Lazarus Long story, Methuselah's Children, where there's a mention that Lazarus had gone to see Pinero the charlatan for a reading, and the only response that he got, because Lazarus Long lived so long, that Pinero just kind of had to have a quizzical look on his face and give him a refund because his machine was apparently broken. So I think that's enough to tie it in with the future history stories. Now, Heinlein worked in kind of a funny little Easter egg into his story. In the opening scene, he has his Dr. Pinero appearing before the Academy of Science, trying to get some credibility for his machine and his theories. And of course, the Academy of Science won't have any of that. They don't believe in him or his machine, and they're ridiculing him, as all good science academies will do for the protagonist scientists of any given science fiction story back in those days. But Heinlein introduces a character, Dr. Van Rheinsmit, as America's handsomest university professor, and he runs the Academy of Science. And that was a dig at the actual Dr. Rufus von Kleinschmidt, who was the 5th president of USC back in Heinlein's day. And when Heinlein was going to UCLA, von Kleinschmidt of USC was often poo-pooing UCLA students as kind of beneath the level of SC students and SC faculty and all that. But he had a penchant for his taking pride in his personal grooming and his fashion sense. He was just very persnickety and fussy about how he was perceived and just thought he was all that. And he also liked to, whenever he could, get in front of reporters' cameras or in the newspapers or newsreels of the day. So Heinlein was having a little funny with the handsomest university professor there. So take that, Rufus. If you've seen any of my other videos, you probably know by now that as an art director in marketing and advertising most of my career, that I really like talking about not just the stories, but the artwork that was inspired by them. And in most cases, those are going to be book covers or maybe a magazine cover. But Heinlein's Lifeline did not make the cover. of that issue. It did, though, have a pretty nice interior title illustration. And so let's take a look at that. This is the one and only illustration for Lifeline, and it's by R. Issip. He did a lot of illustrations for Astounding and other Street and Smith publications in the day, but this was actually the first issue that his artwork ever appeared in, and we'll get to another one of them in the same issue here in a minute. But here, Issip is showing us Dr. Pinero in the foreground here, and he's demonstrating his machine not for the Academy of Science, who wanted to have nothing to do with him here, but instead for a group of reporters who were very interested in the machine. And they took a volunteer from that group of reporters to be hooked up to the machine and get a reading to find out exactly when he will die. And it's an interesting drawing here because there's not a great description of the machine in the story. But Issip here found enough inspiration to come up with these giant, what are those, dynamos in the background? We don't know what they are, towering behind this gallery of reporters that are standing and watching the demonstration. And then this masked faceplate thing that goes over the subject's face there. And then the dials and everything, a kind of a Tesla-looking bulb there. But very interesting and brings to life a lot of the things that aren't really discussed in the story itself. R. Issip, the illustrator here, was born Pogsilong Ray Issip in 1911 in the Philippines. And he is not to be confused with his older brother, Manuel Ray Issip, who, confusingly enough, was also an illustrator for Street and Smith on some of the same publications. So they were often getting confused. They even had the same middle name, middle and last name. Now, Pogsilong signed his name R. Issip, and that's what he went by. But they were always getting confused between each other. In 1926, when R. Issip was 15 years old, he became a newspaper illustrator in Manila. And then when he was 22 years old in 1933, he moved to America to join his brother, Manuel, who was already living and working in New York City. And so when he got to New York City, he studied at the Art Students League and started selling his illustrations to magazines and newspapers in 1938. Now, as I said a minute ago, Issip's first illustrations for Astounding appeared in the same issue as Lifeline did. And, of course, one of those illustrations was for Lifeline. The other one was for the first installment of Frederick Inglehart's General Swamp CIC. Both of those appeared in the same issue. And then, of course, Issip's illustrations for General Swamp CIC continued on future issues, as well as many other illustrations of his. Aside from newspapers and magazines and the pulps, Issip also did a lot of drawings and illustrations for some of the off-brand comic book publishers of the day. Here are just a few examples of some of his comic book work. And he, like I said, some of them were kind of off-brand comic book companies like Better Publications, Iger Comics, and Fiction House. I believe he also did some work for some early Harvey comics, but I don't have any examples of those. So he was doing that for a number of years until World War II came along and he got drafted into the Army in 1942, and he served in the Army until 1946. But he worked for the Office of Special Services, where he got to continue illustrating for patriotic posters and instructional magazines and things like that for the Army. And then in April of 1943, he was naturalized as a U.S. citizen. And then after the war, he went back to his regular art career and also began teaching fine art. And that was R. Issip. Lifeline has been reprinted many times over the years since its first appearance in Astounding, in a lot of different collections and anthologies, but never again with its own illustration. As a short story, it's fairly rare that they select an individual short story to put on the cover of an anthology. It happens sometimes, but not with Lifeline. So I thought, well, in this video, we'll have the one illustration to talk about for the story that we're discussing, and that was it. But then in doing some further research for this video, I came across this, which was just too interesting to pass up. This is a movie poster for Lifeline. It's a short student film that was written and directed by Zach Dodson and co-written and produced by Eric Gignac. And let's just take a look at this poster here. I really like how they've got all these sepia tones here and everything. The film apparently takes place in 1940, when just shortly after when the story first appeared. So it's set in that time. And here we see our Dr. Pinero, which I believe this is a Photoshop filter of actual production stills probably. And it looks like he's got his hand on the controls of his machine down below. Now, I'm going to nitpick it just a little bit here because I'm a damn art director and I can't help it. But it just looks like the lighting is a little bit off. We've got kind of a spotlight on the hand, but we don't have the same lighting on the machine down below. The shadow behind Pinero there seems to be cast from the wrong direction. But all that's easily forgiven in such a great poster like this. I really like the type treatment down below where they replace the hyphen, which you usually see in Lifeline for some reason. But they replace it with that little electronic impulse, heartbeat, medical signal there kind of a thing that traces that timeline through the lettering there. Really captures the period of time, I think, and I applaud projects like this. If you're familiar with Lifeline, the story, you'd realize that this is really a perfect candidate for a student film like this. It's a simple, short story that is compelling. It looks like they set it in the time that it was written, 1939, 1940. So really all they needed to worry about were a few props and some wardrobe, and no CGI or special effects. You don't have to worry about spaceships or creatures or anything like that. It's all a very human story with some mechanical apparatus. I snagged some screen captures from the trailer online so we would have some visuals to chat about. And here are a couple of shots from the opening scene in the story where Dr. Pinero is arguing his findings and his theories to the Academy of Science. It looks like the film was shot all in black and white, which I think is a great choice to really bring home that era of the 1939-1940 time period. And here are a few more frames from the movie. Some of my favorites here are the shots of Pinero operating his device, his apparatus. And we don't need to see a lot. It's just enough to convey that it is definitely that time period, and whatever he's doing, we don't know. Just like in the story, it's not described too much. So the filmmakers here didn't have to create any kind of a machine that was recognizable or that they could go too far wrong with. To me, they really captured it here. On the other hand, there are a few frames that kind of take you out of that time period a little bit, and I'm sure it's budgetary constraints and things like that, but let's just take a quick look at these and I think you'll see what I mean here. Just a few kind of wardrobe and hairstyle changes might have made the difference in some of these cases, and then that last bottom right shot where we're looking out into a fairly modern parking lot. But again, student films, the budgets and other constraints that they have to work with, all completely understandable. And if you're familiar with the story of Lifeline, you've read it already, you should really take a look at this trailer here. I think you'd really appreciate it even more. But that's not all. In conjunction with this student film, there's also a graphic novel that was drawn and produced by Eric Gignac, who was the co-writer and producer of the student film. And this guy is obviously a big Heinlein fan, and he's already done a few other Heinlein stories in graphic novel form. And I'll put a link down below to his website. And I think this, just like the student film was about to premiere back in September, I think the graphic novel was set to be sent out to patrons. It was a Kickstarter project by the end of October. So again, I'll put a link down below in case you're interested in that. So that covers all the artwork that I've been able to find for Lifeline by Robert Heinlein, the original illustration that appeared in the first publication back in 1939, and now this latest student film and graphic novel that's coming out now, 80 years apart. But it's a nice way to bookend The Lifeline by Robert Heinlein. And there you have it. Now, as far as some of these secondary themes from New Worlds November, I'm going to touch on some of those as far as Lifeline goes. And first of all, week 1, we've covered terrestrial, so it took place on planet Earth, good old planet Earth here. And then the sub-themes, I think maybe this can touch on time travel. Not that anyone travels through time, but that signal that goes up and down through the fourth dimension, it bounces off the future death of any of the people hooked up to the machine. That's a form of time travel, so I'm going to count that one. And then it had humorous was one of the things. This story definitely has some humorous elements in it. And then as far as the extra credit, that was the parallel universe, they're calling it, where it goes from the written word into some other medium. And this one went into 2. It went into a student film, so there's a film aspect, and also a graphic novel aspect. So I think that covers a timeline or Lifeline pretty well. And there you have it once again, folks. So I hope you enjoyed it. A little trip down memory lane there for some of us, and looking at the stories behind some of the artwork. And take a look at that student film and at the graphic novels again. I'm not getting paid to do this, but I'm just so impressed with projects like that I kind of want to point anyone into that direction if they're interested in it. So that's it. We'll wrap it up again, and I thank you for watching, and hope to see you again soon. Thanks a lot.